ultra processed foods account for 90% of the added sugar in our diet. Like us actually adding sugar at home is like pretty not nearly as much as like the foods that we're buying and the convenient foods that like dominate our environment. If you look at animals and you try and say, okay, you have a choice between cocaine and sugar, over 70% of the time the animals will choose the sugar.
You are listening to Veggie Doctor Radio, and this is episode number 158. Welcome to Veggie Doctor Radio. I am your host, Dr. Yami, board-certified pediatrician, certified lifestyle medicine physician, certified health and wellness coach, author, speaker, mother, wife, and human being. I passionately believe in the power of diet, habits, and mindset in sparking and sustaining well-being and joy in our lives. This podcast combines expert interviews and thoughtful monologues to explore plant-based nutrition, lifestyle medicine, parenting, mindset, and other exciting and fun topics. I hope that these episodes inspire you, uplift you, and equip you with the knowledge and tools to live your best life. Are you ready to get started? Let's do it. Hello, veggie lovers. How are you today? I hope you are having a very plantastic day and weekend. And for some of you, a 3-day holiday. Hey, woohoo, how fun. Thank you for listening to this on your time off. I appreciate it so much. I have a special favor to ask. Super excited because Veggie Doctor Radio is nearing 500,000 downloads. We are almost to 500,000 downloads. Can you help me get there, please? I would love it if you took a screenshot of this podcast episode and shared it on your social media. Share it in your stories or wherever you want and tag me. I would love to reshare it. I would love to interact with you, my listeners. I love hearing from you. Thank you so much for being so loyal, for listening to these episodes, for giving me feedback. I appreciate it so much. Let's get to 500,000 and beyond together. I want to give a shout out to MJ, who left me a 5-star Amazon review on my book, A Parent's Guide to Intuitive Eating, How to Raise Kids Who Love to Eat Healthy. MJ titled it More Joy in My Life. MJ says, this summer, I stumbled across Dr. Yami's TED Talk, then got into her podcast, Veggie Doctor Radio, which is fantastic, and then read her book. Now I'm a Dr. Yami super fan. Aw, thank you. She gives such solid advice, but makes it so personable, accessible, and doable. And she inspired me to make more sustainable changes in my lifestyle and how I feed my kids and parent them around food. It was actually liberating and has brought more joy into my life. MJ, that just gave me full body chills. There's so much joy inside of me. I'm so happy that one of my main goals of writing this book was achieved through your experience. And much love to you and your family. Thank you so much. Remember that the information on this podcast is for informational and educational purposes only. It is not meant to replace careful evaluation and treatment. So if you have concerns about you or your child's eating, nutrition, or growth, consult a doctor. Okay, I'm not gonna lie. After I finished this interview with Dr. Ashley Gearhardt, I was so hyped up. I had to go outside, jump up and down in place, do deep breathing, stretch. I could not calm down. Like my whole body was hyped. It was so good. It was so good. I kept her for 30 extra minutes. The interview is not that long, but we spent a lot of time talking off recording, and she's brilliant. She's brilliant. She's balanced. She is amazing. I hope I have the chance to either meet her in person someday or have her back on the show. She answered so many of my questions and really helped me understand some things I didn't know about food addiction. So, Dr. Ashley Gearhardt is an associate professor of psychology in the clinical science area at the University of Michigan. She received her Ph.D. in clinical psychology at Yale University with training on the underpinnings of both excess food and alcohol consumption. Dr. Gearhardt currently investigates the contribution of reward dysfunction, e.g., craving liking, to eating related problems across the lifespan. She uses a multi-method approach to explore the neurobiological, psychological, and behavioral factors that contribute to problematic eating behavior. Dr. Gearhardt also investigates the role of addictive processes in compulsive overeating and is the director of Food Addiction Science and Treatment Laboratory. It's called the FAST Lab. So cool. Her research has received funding from the National Institutes of Health and the American Heart Association. She has published over 100 peer-reviewed articles, and her research has been featured on media outlets including the New York Times, ABC News, The Today Show, and Time Magazine. And she has a new website for her lab, and you can find it on sites.lsa.umich.edu/fast lab. But you can also just look her up, Dr. Ashley Gearhardt. Gearhardt is Hardt, University of Michigan. And of course, this will all be linked in the show notes. But I don't want to take up any more time. Let's get on with this interview. It is so good. I hope you love it. You're probably going to have to listen to it more than once because she is full of knowledge and everything she says is just so great. So I hope you love it. Let me know what you think, and I hope that this is helpful. So let us proceed to this wonderful conversation between myself and Dr. Ashley Gearhardt. Dr. Ashley Gearhardt, welcome to Veggie Doctor Radio.
It's absolutely my pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation.
I am super, super excited about this interview. I have a psychology undergrad degree, and I was particularly interested in evolutionary psychology. And I love all the thoughts about evolutionary things. And so I feel like food is perfect for that because it helps me really understand why humans love processed foods. I mean, it just makes so much sense. It's not that there's anything wrong with us. It's that's how we were designed by nature. But, before we started recording, I asked you if you had thoughts on intuitive eating, health at every size, and we'll get into that. But I just wanted to be completely transparent and tell you, I have a history of disordered eating, but then I found intuitive eating. So I've gone from one extreme to another in believing at one point I was part of a 12-step program. So I did believe that I was a food addict. Then I discovered intuitive eating, and all of that addictive behavior just went away. And now I can have that food in my house. So then I was just like, well, then it must not exist. I went from one extreme to another, right? I was like, it definitely exists, and like everybody has it, kind of extreme thinking, to it doesn't even exist. But, as life teaches you things, and I've kept an open mind, and I've been observing and looking, and now I think, well, maybe it's just not the way I didn't understand it correctly. And so I want to bring in more people to my podcast to talk about this issue, but also so that I can learn how to best help people, because ultimately I just want to help people so that there's less suffering, there's more joy, more well-being and longevity. So let's set the stage. Let's create a good foundation here for my listeners. How do you define food addiction?
Yes. So the way that I define food addiction in my research and the way that it's commonly defined in the field is by using the diagnostic criteria that we use to establish whether someone is just a social drinker or they actually have a clinically significant substance use disorder that's focused on alcohol. It's the same diagnostic criteria we use for tobacco or cocaine or alcohol or heroin. And what we're really looking at, because most people use addictive substances at some point in their life, and most people don't get addicted to them. And so it really is a question that you can't just say, oh, are you using an addictive substance? But it's really about what is your relationship to that substance that helps us determine whether an addiction has occurred. And so some of the core criteria that are kind of at the heart of things are, a loss of control, that, you you when you start consuming, you have a really hard time stopping yourself. Continued use despite negative consequences. Those can be psychological or physical medical health conditions. Really intense and strong cravings. People can endorse signs of withdrawal that when they cut down, they experience irritability, agitation, heightened cravings, a feeling of depression, and that oftentimes people will report that they over time catch themselves eating more and more and more to kind of reach that desired feeling of pleasure or that reduction in negative affect. So that's a lot of what we're looking at. It's based on your, behavioral relationship with the substance that helps us determine whether someone's a user, maybe a heavy user, or whether they actually are experiencing an addictive level of response to the substance that we might want to really consider some clinical care around.
Awesome. Yeah, that makes it super clear. And this isn't 100% accepted, right? So there's definitely
Yes.
lots of researchers in the food addiction world, but then there's people that are like, that's not a thing. Why is that?
Absolutely. So it is a very controversial topic. And I would say there's two big domains of controversy. Interestingly, I would say the area that I get the least controversy is actually in the field of addiction researchers. I think
Mm,
that over time, identifying what substance or behavior is capable of triggering an addiction, we've kind of been through the ringer as a field. We spent 3 decades arguing about whether cigarettes could be addictive, even though they were killing, 300,000 people a year.
mhm,
And about 80% of people who tried to quit smoking ended up relapsing. And, people would have a hole put in their throat to breathe, and then they would go and start smoking again. But it didn't look like the stereotype of an addiction, right? You didn't get high, you didn't get intoxicated. It was legal, it was accessible. You could take care of your kid, drive your car, and you weren't really overdosing on it. The withdrawal syndrome didn't look like withdrawal from other drugs. It wasn't like you were going to die from the withdrawal syndrome when you tried to cut down on cigarettes. But it was obviously something that people were losing control over. They couldn't stop themselves, even if they wanted to. They had really intense cravings. They had a strong psychological withdrawal syndrome. And over time, we realized that these processed tobacco products that the industry had really engineered and designed to kind of hook us were highly addictive. And when you look at all the addictive substances that are currently recognized out there, cigarettes are the biggest killer, actually more than like alcohol and opioids combined.
mm,
So it kind of really changed what we thought of when we thought about what are the substances that can trigger an addictive response. And so I think in general, when people think about these, I'll call them highly processed foods that have often been engineered and designed to have naturally high levels of refined carbohydrates and fat. They're legal. You're not high, you're not overdosing. Can you really get addicted to that? And I would say that those surface level factors that lead people to disregard this are the same surface level factors that led them to disregard cigarette smoking
yeah.
as an addictive substance. And when you look at the health consequence of diet related disease in our society, twice as many people are dying, about 600,000 people are dying of preventable death due to diet related disease that's associated with overconsumption of these, nutritionally poor, highly processed foods. And when we look at our success rates of helping people sustain dietary change, it's actually worse than the outcomes for addiction recovery. So we see about 90% of people end up failing to maintain their dietary change in the long term. So I think those factors to me, I think those surface level factors lead people to kind of disregard it. If they're thinking of like heroin or cocaine, it seems a little silly. But when you think about cigarettes, the parallels become really clear. And I would say the other one is that, we all have to eat, of course. It's not like you can opt out of eating in the way that you can opt out of going to the bar, you can opt out of smoking a cigarette. And so, we need to eat to live. And so, where I think it's really key is that, the term food addiction, I actually feel strongly is a misnomer. We used
Mm,
that term when we started this research because we didn't really have evidence at that point about what types of foods were most likely to trigger this process, and we didn't want to get ahead of the science. So we used food. At this point, from our research and others, it's pretty clear to me that it's these highly processed foods, particularly with high levels of rapidly absorbed refined carbohydrates, and then when supplemented with fat, that seem to be the foods that people are most likely to consume in an addictive way.
Mm.
And so if we, waved a magic wand and all the highly processed junk food disappeared from our society, I think many of us, myself included, would feel sad. There's for most of us, there's a place for those of us in our life. Um, but we wouldn't die. We would be able to eat if the minimally processed, more nutritious foods were still available to us. We would actually thrive and have longer, more healthy lives. And so there's this kind of controversy right now that maybe it's a behavioral addiction to the act of eating rather than about the food. And I feel strongly that that isn't the case. Because of that reason that I mentioned to you, that it's we really don't see people losing control and binging on kale and black beans. When we do animal models, you cannot get rats hooked on their nutritionally complete, minimally processed kind of boring chow, no matter what you do, but you sprinkle a little sugar on it and they're, off to the races. And so I really think the food and how we alter and process it is a key driving component to the presence of that addictive behavioral pattern.
So there's no broccoli addicted rats in your
No.
lab anywhere.
Nope, nope. And yeah, we actually see when we've done work on like what foods are the least addictive for people, it's always like black beans are at the bottom of the list. I think there's probably an aversion. If you like binge on black beans, you're gonna pay. So when we look at the foods that even foods people really like watermelon and berries, people like them and they enjoy them and they want them, but when it comes to this kind of compulsive, out of control phenotype that is associated with like you just couldn't stop even if your doctor told you tomorrow that it was going to take 10 years off your life. We just don't see that sort of behavior occur with the foods that are minimally processed that have existed for most of our human experience on this planet.
Yeah. And I wonder too if just because you said that word addiction can
Yeah,
be for a lot of people it brings up this stereotype of a junkie. And you
yeah,
have this
yeah,
look this idea of what a junkie looks like. You're homeless on the street, you don't have
yes.
any money, disheveled. And so I think that eliminates a lot of things that we know can have an addictive component to them, just like you said, cigarettes, like, and food. But that brings me to my next question. You mentioned obviously the health problems. I'm a lifestyle medicine physician as well,
Yeah.
so that is a very big deal to me, is to educate people on how they can be empowered to take charge of their health so that they can have more well-being and longevity. But let's talk about body weight for a second,
Yeah,
because that's a very touchy subject.
absolutely.
And one thing that I was surprised about when I've heard you speak before, the association between food addiction and body weight. Is everybody that might be considered a food
Yeah.
addict overweight or obese?
Absolutely not. So, I mean, we definitely see there's an association. I was just reading a study that came out in addiction with a really beautiful large sample that found like, yeah, the likelihood of food addiction is increased for individuals who have overweight and obesity. But even in the context of obesity, it's only at 30%. So, 70% of individuals with a higher body mass index are not necessarily meeting this food addiction criteria. And similarly, we are seeing individuals who are normal weight or even underweight that are endorsing this relationship with food that meets those core diagnostic criteria for addiction. Is that meaningful? Well, the study that I'm just reading finds that this food addiction behavioral phenotype is much more strongly associated with poor quality of life across the board, physical, social, mental, psychological, than the size of your body. And I'm a big proponent that you cannot look at someone's body size and assume you know anything about their
Mm.
relationship with food. It's not a one-to-one basis. And for me, that was part of actually one of the motivators of doing this work was that before I developed the Yale Food Addiction Scale, obesity was kind of being used as this proxy for somebody who was addicted to these foods. And I felt like that was a big mistake, both assuming you knew someone's relationship with food without assessing it, and also assuming that if someone had a, normal body mass index, that you then assumed they had a healthy relationship with food and there weren't any struggles there. And so that's why I really turned to understanding those behavioral indicators that we use for every other addictive substance to really quantify this, compulsive addictive relationship with these foods and not to rely on, body size as a proxy.
I love that. Thank you so much for giving us that information. And I think that just reaffirms more and more that we cannot judge a book by its cover, especially in medicine. I know I'm a physician. There is a lot of weight bias, there's a lot
Yes,
of
very much
assumptions,
so.
discrimination based on that. And basically, what you're saying is, the majority of people that might be classified as
Mhm.
overweight actually don't meet criteria
You've
for
got it.
food addiction.
Yes,
So we can't just
exactly.
assume that if you're overweight, it's because you're a food addict.
That's 100% true. That's absolutely true. Like you cannot assume from someone's body shape whether they have an addiction to food in any capacity. I always try and really make a distinguishing factor for me. It's really key between a specific person and saying, like, are you demonstrating signs of addiction to a clinical level in your own life that we might say, okay, there's an addiction here, and we want a kind of treatment plan for you and think about how might we tailor interventions to target those addictive mechanisms in a way that's going to help you succeed. And I think this is important because we're finding that in some large weight loss treatment trials, individuals who meet the food addiction criteria are the most likely to drop out and the most likely that if they stay in the treatment to actually gain weight rather than lose it in the course of the trial.
Mm,
So if you have a higher body weight and you make a personal choice that you would like to lose the weight, which is not for anyone, that's not a universal necessity. This is an individual and personalized choice. And you are showing this addictive response to these foods, and you go to the traditional, calories in, calories out, eat this, eat not that. And there's no consideration of that addictive, the reward pull, the emotional aspects of things, the cravings, the triggers. Those treatments are not working well for anybody, and they might not be working particularly well for you. And so I think that's important for kind of tailoring treatment.
yes.
On the other end, when I think of if we think about the food and don't pay as much attention to, are you addicted or not? But if we think of these highly processed foods have this addictive pull, like I mentioned, we know most people who use an addictive substance don't get addicted. Even with cocaine, right? It's about like 1 in 5 actually get addicted. Most people don't. Now, does that mean that it's risk-free? It doesn't, because most of us who drink something like alcohol, even though only about 12% of people are going to actually have an alcohol use disorder, when you're in an environment where alcohol is cheap and legal and easily accessible and heavily marketed and a key part of the social fabric, even people who aren't showing a full-blown addiction are prone to overuse it and
Hmm.
to experience enough of an addictive pull that it can start to negatively impact their physical health and their mental well-being. I'm on a college campus, so like, I see a lot of my students coming in and they're hungover or they're depressed or they're missing class, and I don't think it's because they're necessarily addicted to alcohol, but the environment is so toxic around alcohol that it drives even someone who isn't at that clinical level to experience problems. When I
Yes.
think of this food environment, I think that the foods that I see of as being most addictive are so dominant in our food supply, so accessible, so heavily advertised, so a huge part of our social fabric that even if you don't have a full-blown addiction, but you're feeling enough of a pull from these foods to overeat, 300, 400 calories more a day than you need to thrive, that's really problematic. And so I think a lot about the environmental pressures of addictive substances and how they can lead to overconsumption on a broad scale, even for people who aren't full-blown clinically addicted, but enough that it's impacting the quality of their life.
Yes. Oh, I love that so much. It's a spectrum, right? Because just the
Absolutely.
difference between disordered eating and an eating disorder. I feel like I was a
Absolutely.
disordered eater for decades and it was causing
Hmm.
me massive emotional pain, I did not meet criteria for a full-blown
Yes.
eating disorder, but even if I didn't, the issues were enough that getting
Yeah.
help is going to improve my quality of life. So some of it is just, these scientific, we have to sometimes put criteria, we have to
Yeah,
be able to count things and how many do you have, but at the end of the day, what you're saying is we really have to tune into how much is it affecting you? And do you feel like you're
absolutely.
living up to your potential? Do you feel like you're having the joy that you want in your life, or is this holding you back and limiting you?
Absolutely. That's absolutely true. Yes, you put that very nicely.
So I have a question because, like I said, I was in a 12-step program for a
Mhm.
while, about a year. And I just wonder what your thoughts are on the label. Because we talked
Yeah.
about before how this can be for some people kind of triggering and kind of like, ugh,
Mhm.
no, that just yucky. It just makes me think of a junkie or whatever. Do you
Yeah.
think it is helpful for some people to label themselves as addicts? Do you think for some
Yeah.
people it could be harmful? What are your thoughts?
Absolutely. So I think there's a no there's nothing that in the field of addiction that's one size fits all at all. And we even see this with something like alcohol, where for some people, saying I have an addiction to alcohol and it is a disease and it is never getting better, and I need to kind of organize my life around this addictive label is really helpful for them and taking it seriously and prioritizing it and helping them seek professional help. For other people, we find that that label is really harmful and it turns them off. And so, what I've seen in the addiction field that I really like, and I hope we model in the realm of these foods, is that there's options out there that are on multiple comfort levels. So we have these harm reduction approaches in alcohol use disorder that are supported by science, where you don't have to label yourself an addict and you don't have to say, I'm never drinking alcohol ever again. And that for some people, especially who have a more mild or moderate experience of, problems with alcohol, we're able to work with them to say, how let's change your relationship with alcohol. How do we reduce the harm? What are skills and strategies and safe places for you to learn to use in a way where this is maybe still a part of your life, but it isn't taking it over? And
Mm,
part of that is saying that there's also a spectrum of risk of the substances, right? Saying, let's have you drink Bacardi 151 in a safe manner is a much harder ask than like a glass of wine that's on the lower alcohol side. And so we might say, yeah, for you, drinking you might have to give up liquor. It's too risky, it's too addictive, but perhaps you can learn socially safe ways to consume a glass of wine with dinner or a beer every now and then. That was very controversial and a big fight in the field of addiction, but it's now like kind of a standard empirically supported treatment. I would say in the realm of addictive eating and with these foods, the treatment space hasn't been filled out as much. And so there's the 12-step approach of kind of abstinence only, I am an addict, and I do talk to people where they say, this is the only thing that's ever worked for me. And
mhm,
this label really helped me recover. And I tried everything else under the sun. For other people, that is not. And unfortunately, we don't have enough science necessarily around what are the potential pros and cons of a 12-step program, and for whom is it helpful and for whom is it maybe damaging?
mm,
But what I'm hoping in my own career to do is to kind of broaden out that space where there's an opportunity for some of those kind of harm reduction sort of approaches that does acknowledge that, not all foods are created equal, I would say, in their risk potential, that there's a spectrum of risk, and that for each person it's somewhat individualized, and that we can acknowledge the role of the food while also acknowledging what you need as a person and what your specific goals are. And that absolutely does not need to require abstaining from all, processy or sugar foods, that for many people, that's probably a step too far.
yes. Oh, I love that. That openness to be able to individualize based upon
Mhm.
your history, your genetics, your personality, and maybe even just presenting things in a way to people that let's try it this way and see how it works
Yeah,
for you. What imagine yourself thinking of yourself as an addict. How does that feel? Does that make you
absolutely.
feel like worse about yourself, or does that make you feel safe and confident, And
Yeah.
so I think being able to have this openness that it is not one size fits all, and that some things might help some people and maybe not help some people as much, I think is a right step in the direction where we can start helping more people overall.
I agree. And I think again, I try and separate a little bit out for the specific person and focusing on the substance, which in this case
Hmm.
to me are these highly processed foods. Because, we talk a lot about what's the potential risk of labeling these foods as addictive. For some people, is it going to make them feel worse? So far, the science is not supporting the idea that saying that there's an addiction to these foods actually. There's some evidence that it reduces stigma, although the literature is mixed, but in general, it doesn't seem to increase stigma towards individuals with higher body weight. So that was a big relief for me in doing this science. I did not want to increase stigma, and thus far, the science seems to suggest that it doesn't. Um, but that I think there's a big risk of if these foods are addictive and there's a $1 trillion industry that is benefiting from them and creating them and marketing and engineering them. And we're saying, oh no, this food isn't addictive. It's just a function of willpower, trying hard enough, white knuckling it. We were like that with tobacco for a very long time. Oh no, cigarettes aren't addictive. It's just a bad habit. People just need to try harder. And what that did was it really let the industry have a very big pass for a very long time to continue really ethically questionable practices that hooked, a new generation of smokers. And people weren't fully informed about the risk they were taking when they were smoking a cigarette because they thought, oh, I can stop it anytime. This
Yeah.
isn't an addiction. And so I think there's some big risks if these foods do meet the scientific consensus for addiction, which I think that evidence is growing. If we ignore that, I think it does just suggest to people, well, why aren't I able to just get a
Yes.
handle on this? In the same way people ask, why can't I just quit smoking when I
Yeah.
tried? And I think this is particularly relevant for two reasons. One is the intense marketing towards children and adolescents that
Mm.
the food industry does, and in ways that it's hard for parents to monitor, like on advert gaming and social media. And also social justice issues that if you are of a lower income bracket in the United States, in many ways, the only source of calories that are accessible and economically available to you are from these foods that we think may be able to trigger addictive processes in your psyche and in your brain. And
Yeah.
there's a fundamental social justice issue, I think, if individuals just due to having less power in our society do not have equal access to nutritious options and are being targeted by industries that hook them and make money off them.
Oh my goodness, so much to unpack there. I recently read Hooked by Michael Moss.
Yeah.
I'm sure you've read it, and
Yes.
he goes
Yeah.
through
Talked
some
with him a
cases
lot.
in there.
Yeah.
And but it just reminds me of that, a lot of people talk about gaslighting these days.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you
Yeah.
think of this industry creating foods that make it really hard for people to stop eating on purpose so that people buy them. And then when people make criticism about the food, they're like, oh no, you should be able to include this as part of any moderate lifestyle. You
Yeah.
can stop anytime. And if you can't, it's your fault. They put the blame
Yes.
on the individual. So then that means that the person that can't stop eating these things, there's something wrong with them personally. It's not the
That's
food.
exactly right. And I mean, if you watch the documentary on the Sackler family with opioids, and they did that same playbook. Like they pushed their opioid medications out, they advertised it aggressively, they didn't do appropriate safety monitoring. And when it became clear that people were becoming addicted and it was driving the current opioid epidemic, they very intentionally said, well, we're just going to label anybody who's struggling as a criminal and a bad
Mm,
person. And it's not our fault for creating this product and pushing it and not doing safety testing. It's just these bad people who don't have personal responsibility.
yeah.
And of course, like we all have a role to play in our own life to promote our health, but companies should not be making billions and trillions of dollars off of making it harder for us to live a healthy, high quality life.
Yeah. Ugh. Oh, that's just so intense. Well, let me tell you a little story that I think is
Yeah.
super interesting. My husband and I got the opportunity to go to the Greek islands a couple of years ago
Oh,
to
lovely.
celebrate our 40th birthdays. It was really fantastic. We loved it so much. One evening, we were having dinner, this little cafe with the owner was the chef and everything. It was darling. And the food in Greece is just, I'm just going to not even exaggerate here. It's amazing. Okay.
Mm.
Everything is amazing. And my husband and I are foodies. So we would every dinner just like try to eat as much as possible because we're
Mhm.
also American, right? Which
Yes,
is kind of leading
totally.
me into this question. But we were going through this menu and we're ordering all this stuff. It's just two people. And the owner's taking our order and he stops us. He's like, that's enough. You're on holiday. You don't want to ruin your
Uh-huh.
holiday. Like
Uh-huh.
in his mind, he's like
Yeah.
overeating is going to make you feel bad. Why are you ordering
Yeah.
so much food? And I have never forgotten that story because a lot of people in Greece are lean and active and they seem to be really enjoying their life. But maybe it's just because I was on vacation. Who knows? But I feel in the United States is the opposite. Like in the United States is how much can we eat? How much can we
Yeah.
put on our plate? Overeating is celebrated. It's part of
Yeah.
like every sporting event, everything, everything. So I know that the processed food industry is permeating the entire globe now, and so it's everywhere. But how much do you think some of these eating behaviors and some of these habits that we start from a young age are
Yeah.
culturally based?
Huge. I actually just had this conversation with my lab today, where we were talking about, one of the things that is beneficial in many countries like Italy or Greece, where like, alcohol, consuming, a good drink, a nice glass of red wine or something is a big part of the culture. It's not that they're countries that typically have low addiction rates and lower obesity rates. But it's not like they're teetotalers who never drink or don't appreciate wine. But there's some pretty noticeable cultural bounds, at least historically, around when it is appropriate and not appropriate to consume the addictive substance. And so it's often a special occasion, something that you do socially with others, that there's certain times or periods that you consume it. And this is actually a very effective cultural gatekeeping
Mm-hmm.
to reduce the harms of an addictive substance. It both kind of can help us maybe catch people earlier who start deviating from those norms to know that maybe the substance is starting to hook them. But in general, willpower actually kind of sucks. Our willpower is not very strong. And if you're actively trying to prevent yourself from engaging in something that's tempting, that burns out. But
Yes.
there's something about this kind of cultural gatekeeping that kind of help like turns off the temptation drive for you. So like I have a bottle of red wine on my kitchen counter right now, and that at 10 a.m., even if I'm stressed, even if I had a really bad day, it doesn't sound in any way appealing to me because there's cultural bounds that like you only drink at certain times of day and in certain settings after 5 p.m. Now, once it's like 5:30 and I'm stressed out, I've had a hard day and I'm cooking dinner, the red wine looks real good. The red wine itself hasn't changed, right? But the cultural and cued situation around the wine has changed. When I look at what's happened to our food environment, especially in America, all the cultural mores are
Yeah.
off, right? It's not like you have, a dessert, you only have a nice, piece of dessert, at the end of a meal that's kind of high quality in a small portion size. We're having cake for breakfast. We're having, like there's more icing and or more sugar in many of those like kiddie cereals than there are in a piece of cake. And, we're kind of off to the races. You eat in your car, you eat at your office, you eat at 11 o'clock at night, you eat by yourself. When we look at this addictive eating behavior, it's not people necessarily often sitting down in a mindful way with like a good meal with people they care about and savoring the food. It's this kind of shoveling the food as rapidly as possible into their mouth alone late at night, and this kind of when they're bored and they're sad and they're stressed, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so one of the things I think about again is like, so why? Why did that suddenly happen? Right? Like we used to have a more restrained culture around these sort of foods and when we eat them. And it really it's been a very successful effect of the food industry. Again, not to always come back to them, but through
Marketing.
their marketing and through the changes of, a third meal, midnight snack, drinking soda all day, every day, constantly dosing yourself with a big gulp has become socially acceptable and not seen as something that's outside of cultural norms. And
Mhm.
without that cultural gatekeeping, it's even more tempting and challenging for us to resist the pull and allure of these foods.
Yeah.
And we're seeing, unfortunately, places like Greece and France that have had very strong food cultures as our kind of Americanized, food industries have gotten a stronger and stronger foothold there. We're seeing much of their food culture that's protective start to erode with the introduction of our westernized, Americanized food industry. So we're
Mhm.
exporting this around the globe, unfortunately.
Yeah, yeah. And I feel like in the United States, because food and eating has become such a dominant part of our every second life, is
Yeah,
that now you're almost peer pressured to engage in it. So if you
certainly.
go to a party and you don't eat something, it's like, why not? Because when I work with coaching clients as well, and that's one of the biggest obstacles is
Yes, absolutely.
being singled out. Why aren't you eating the cake? Why aren't you joining us
100%.
in this indulgence? But the indulgences are every single day.
Yeah.
It's like there's not just like a season or a holiday, it's an everyday event now. And that makes it really difficult for some people.
And we're starting to also see this idea that like that, the more you're eating this stuff, the more tolerant you get to it, right? It doesn't give you the same reward
Yeah.
hit as it did if it was an occasional indulgence, as if you're doing it every single day. I mean, I really think we have to ask ourselves, like the Coca-Cola bottle that is now like a single serving size for one person that you get, at the gas station when you check out. If you look at old Coca-Cola advertisements, that was the size that was sold as a family-sized bottle for the whole family. It's like, why have our portion sizes gotten so incredibly out of control? I think in part it's that like we're consuming it so frequently, so regularly, and that our brain begins to adapt to
Yes.
that. And that same amount of Coca-Cola doesn't give you the same reward hit that it used to. And so you either need a substance that's more intensely rewarding or a larger portion size. In the same way we see with alcohol, that people will go from, a lower alcohol beer to a higher alcohol beer and then drink more and more of it because it's just not doing it the way that it once was. There's evidence that these foods, go through the same process. And so it leaves us in this feeling of kind of needing more and more and more to kind of get that reward fix, especially if we're comparing it to, maybe early memories of the first time we had a cupcake or, a soda and it was so salient. So we go in with this strong expectation. We see this in our research that people who have more addictive eating have these really high, very positive expectancies of about how much joy and how much desire and how wonderful it's going to be to get these foods. But when they actually eat it, it doesn't live up to the expectation. So you're kind of chasing that high and you're consuming more and more and more. And we see that, again, people who have this more addictive eating pattern have incredibly negative expectations about healthy food. They really expect that they're going to feel disappointed and deprived, and it isn't going to be really rewarding. But in reality, they might actually feel better in a more sustained way if they do start to eat more of those minimally processed foods. But those expectations that, again, have been driven in large part by our marketing environment, that, Snickers and Coca-Cola are going to give you pleasure, and, a really vegetable forward dish is not, really can be an obstacle for people trying to test that in their own lives and reality testing and say, well, is that really true for me anymore or
Wow.
ever?
Wow. Wow. That's just fascinating. It almost to me like the phrase that just popped in my mind is dopamine imprinting. Like thinking
Yeah,
of these memories from childhood, the first time you ever tasted something and everything
yeah,
just lit up and exploded. You're like, yes, I'm gonna keep seeking this. And then that
totally.
phrase that they say, chasing the dragon, in the addiction
Yes,
community is you can
totally.
never quite get there, but you're trying. That dopamine's telling you, come on, you got to try to get it. So you're just going to get more and more and more, but you're never, it's almost like that dopamine imprinting. The memory is much larger than anything you can ever reproduce again.
Yeah.
So
Yes, it's so
interesting.
true. And just to think about like how powerful, sugar is and like, like ultra processed foods account for 90% of the added sugar in our diet. Like
Mm.
us actually adding sugar at home is like pretty not nearly as much as like the foods that we're buying and the convenient foods that like dominate our environment. If you look at animals and you try and say, okay, you have a choice between cocaine and sugar, over 70% of the time, the animals will choose the sugar.
Wow.
It just like it's extremely hard to get them. You have to, even if you super manipulate and you do all these things to try and reduce the impact of the sugar, still about half the animals will still choose the sugar over the cocaine, even if you try and minimize the rewarding impact of the sugar. And so the foods in our environment are actually working with our biology. We're designed and engineered from our evolutionary drive to make sure we're getting enough calories to want and desire and need these foods. We don't have any sort of existing internal system to make sure we're getting enough cocaine, right? So cocaine and heroin and nicotine, they have to be so powerful that they can start to hijack those like reward and motivational drive systems to try and move you towards, those substances. In contrast, you really don't have to start futzing with our food environment too much and how rewarding and reinforcing it is by adding, refined carbohydrates and fats and flavor enhancers to start to see those reward and motivation systems go
Mm-hmm.
awry and
Mm-hmm.
to make it challenging to kind of, get them back on track because you're working with biology that has very weak breaks around high calorie foods.
Yeah, for a good reason, for survival, right? I
Absolutely.
mean, it's
If
it's a really good
Yeah,
reason, which is
exactly the same. Yeah,
when I changed
totally.
my mindset about, it's not that there's something inherently wrong with me, it's that I'm a very good survivor, actually.
Absolutely.
That's why
Oh,
I
that's
love these
exactly what I
foods.
was gonna say. I always tell people that. It's like the same risk factors that now set people up to suffer in this environment would have been beneficial and helped you survive and pass on your genes for the vast, vast majority of human existence. It's not that there's something wrong with you. It's that the food environment has changed in a way that now turns your strengths into, potential weaknesses.
Yeah. And I just was going to add from my experience as a physician and working with clients, the good news is that even though we can neuroadapt to these higher and higher levels of these hyper processed foods, when we stop consuming them, we can
Yeah,
downregulate those receptors and we can neuroadapt back to these whole natural foods. And you get
you're
to
right.
one point where you're enjoying those foods just as much without the rotten side effects of some of these hyper processed foods, which so that the hope is not lost.
I
We can
completely
do that,
agree
which
with
our
that.
brain is so incredible that it can do that.
Absolutely. It's not your biology at this moment is not written in stone, that there's, a lot that you can do to help neuroadapt. Now, I always try and not downplay it. It's a really hard journey and that I see a lot of people white knuckling it on their own and then really beating themselves up that
Mm-hmm.
it's not working. And it's, I in many ways, and Michael Moss talks about this in his book, harder to change this addictive pull to food given our environment.
Yeah.
Nobody's bringing in little bottles of wine that you have to resist at 7 a.m. in a morning meeting where you're already tired and cranky, right? But the likelihood that there's going to be donuts
Donuts.
or cookies or bagels or things that are going to give you this like quick dopamine rush, with the food world, it's very likely you're going to see this. And so, be compassionate with yourself and seek out, support from people that are going to help you, make this journey that's really worth it to improve the
Yeah.
quality of your life, but it is not an easy one. So yeah, be compassionate with yourself.
Yeah. Oh, that's such important information. Okay, let's switch gears just a little bit.
Mhm.
Another quick story. Yesterday, my accountant emailed me a figure that I was my taxes for my business taxes. It was double what I expected. I was quite displeased to the
Yes,
point where I wanted
totally.
to cry and I wanted to literally dive headfirst into chocolate cake. Like that's really what
Hmm.
I wanted. I'm just like, I want to eat over this so bad. Turns out
Totally.
he miscommunicated and it was fine, much less than I
Oh gosh,
expected
I'm
to.
so
Oh,
glad.
so
Oh,
the
that's
the
good.
the moral of the story is, of course,
Yeah,
I didn't dive headfirst into chocolate.
yeah,
I didn't have any available with me. I was at work, and I don't keep food there besides my lunchbox, which is all health promoting foods. Um,
yeah.
but it just highlights to me that I definitely have, and I've even had genetic testing for this. I don't know what gene it is, but it says I'm more likely to be an emotional eater and an
Yeah,
overeater. So, can you help describe a little bit of this difference between this food addiction, the criteria for food
yeah,
addiction, overeating, emotional eating, but also how mood disorders can have an eating component. So,
absolutely.
depression, one of the things there is that you can overeat, undereat. So, I think
Totally.
sometimes also at the beginning, I got these confused and thought it was all the same thing, but it's
Yeah,
not. So, can you tease out a
it's
little
not.
bit the difference?
Absolutely. So I'm going to go back to alcohol. I hope you don't mind because
No, of
I
course
always
not.
use like other addictive substances to give a vibe. There is a tendency to overdrink, right? There's, which I think of as the parallel to overeat. And so lots of people will drink too much on a given night, have more than the one glass of wine that's good, that's health, that is suggested for health promoting benefits, or go out with some friends and, tie one on and have a hangover. And that, that is an act of over drinking. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have an addiction. Now, people who do have an addiction are chronically over drinking, right? It's like a much more prevalent, standard, common part of their day that's occurring, even if there's really significant consequences. You're getting DUIs, your partner's very mad at you, you're not functioning at work, and you're still continuing to overdrink on a regular basis. So, uh, all addicts are kind of over consuming. All people with addictions are over consuming, but not all people who over consume have an addiction.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of going along that spectrum more, similarly, like that emotionally triggered use. A lot of people will have a bad day and you get a beer, get a glass of wine as a way to kind of come down or deal with some negative emotion. Again, not everybody who does that has an addiction at all, but most people who have an addictions, that one of the biggest driving factors is that desire to cope, especially with negative affect. And so, again, it's just because you're using in response to emotions, it doesn't mean that you have an addiction, but if you have an addiction, you're likely to probably doing that very, very regularly. Now, we do see that one of the probably most predictive precursors across the board for addictions is that desire to use to cope. And so I would say if someone is noticing that they are regularly using these foods or alcohol or things to cope, and that's their main coping strategy, you are at a heightened risk. It doesn't mean you have an addiction yet, but like that is one of the major factors that seems to discriminate people who are at risk for an addiction versus those who are not. So monitoring that can be really key. Um, and that idea of like the idea of depression or other mood disorders, we see that the co-occurrence of depression and anxiety disorders and mood disorders with addictions is extremely high.
Mm.
And we don't know, not everyone who has a mood disorder has an addiction, and not everyone who has an addiction has a mood disorder, but the co-occurrence, I don't want to throw out a specific number because I don't want to communicate the exact prevalence, but it is exceptionally high. It's more it's more likely to occur than not to occur. That you're going to often have, some sort of co-occurring kind of mood disorder or other. Post-traumatic stress trauma is also something that's exceptionally highly co-occurring with addictive disorders. We also see that this is true in the context of food addiction, that depression disorders, post-traumatic stress disorders, those kind of mood and emotion related disorders are very highly co-occurring with food addiction. And so oftentimes you'll want to have a treatment provider who is considering both, considering the full complex profile of what you might be dealing with, and not, just focusing on the mood disorder or just focusing on the addiction, because they can really feed each other in ways that can be damaging. The addictive substance or behavior can make the depression worse. The depression sets you up to be more vulnerable to using the addictive substance to cope, and they can feed on each other. And so you really want to kind of hold both.
Yes. Thank you for teasing that out. But it sounds
Sure.
like basically it's complicated. The
It's
human brain
complicated.
is complex.
Absolutely. It's very, very true. And, kind of going back to your points, the we get kind of obsessed with buckets and labels. And I think there's important reasons for doing that to kind of have a better understanding of what's going on. But, I really like what you've talked about of like not so much having to obsess over, am I an addict or not, or am I an emotional eater but not an addict? What are you thriving? What's
Yes.
getting in the way of your quality of life, and what is beneficial for you personally to help you get to the other side is much more important than having some objectively correct label because, like you said, it's complex.
Yeah. And I think that's what makes it hard sometimes to read the research that's animal based,
Yeah,
because as a human, we have so much pain, but it's not
yeah,
a physical pain. It's this emotional pain. Like
yes,
this consequence that happened, you owe double what you think you owe on taxes, only
yeah,
happened in my brain. Like
yeah,
nothing physically changed in my life. It was like literally one line in an email. And it
yeah,
created this emotional chaos, like, oh my gosh, panic, sadness.
totally.
And I felt like I needed to self soothe.
Yep.
But is there like some sort of animal model that's analogous? Like, have they done studies? And
Yeah,
I hate this because, I'm also vegan, so I hate thinking
yeah,
of hurting poor animals. But is there
yeah.
a way to study this in animals?
Yeah, there is. They do like intermittent stress exposure. There are approaches in animals to heighten, their stress, unfortunately, and their experience of kind of low mood. And, one of the most effective ways that, again, is kind of mimic some of the trauma that we experience as humans is of, the pups being removed from their moms,
Mm-hmm.
on an earlier developmentally level. And so, when I see a lot of evidence of neglect or trauma or emotional abuse kind of setting people up for an addiction, when we look at those animal models, we do see that it sets up stress systems and reward systems in a way that really can make you more vulnerable to the addictive nature of other substances and of food.
Yeah.
It's again like a really parallel mechanism. And in some ways, when I look at these animal models and I see how incredibly powerful the addictive capacity is for these foods for an animal who in many ways has a life that's less complex,
Yes.
and isn't ruminating per se on things and isn't subjected to much of the stigma and trauma and things that's part of the human experience. It sets me up how even more vulnerable we are as humans in many ways to the addictive pull of these foods.
Yes. Oh, so good. So good. Okay. Let's move on to talking about intuitive eating
Yeah,
and health at every size. So, like I said before, my journey has been one where I've experienced some of this intensity. I did that food addiction scale at the height of my restriction and what I was doing. And I was like, full blown,
yeah.
But then I discovered intuitive eating, and all of that seemed to change dramatically. So, what research has been done on using these intuitive eating principles or mindfulness, which kind of came up a little bit earlier, to help with food addiction? Do you think it can be helpful?
Yeah.
What's the relationship there as far as how you understand it currently?
Absolutely. So I would say it's a huge area where there's more research that needs to be done. I would say in a whole, there's been kind of an adversarial relationship between kind of the addiction perspective and the intuitive eating perspective, and the health at any size perspective in a way that I really don't feel necessarily needs to be there. Some more conversation and crosstalk rather than kind of avoidance and kind of
Yeah.
throwing bombs at each other is probably really what's warranted. And, again, I think going back to kind of starting with the health at any size movement is, again, part of what motivated me to do this scale was to say, I want to understand the relationship with food rather than using body size as a proxy for a healthy relationship with food or an unhealthy relationship with food. And in general, I do want there to be an environment where people are able to achieve, a size and a body shape that works for them and is their personally fits in their lifestyle. And I don't want there to be an environment that has a tendency to drive, um, most of us towards a higher body size just by going with the flow of a food environment that's pushing, kind of quick hits of pleasure through food, in a way that can set us up to be at higher risk, even though we never intended to be so and that we're
Mm-hmm.
not informed. So I'm a big fan of trying to reduce weight stigma of people, feeling that, we, that. there is no one right way to have a certain body weight or to that it reflects a certain relationship with food. And so like I don't think this is like, yes, we need to, everyone needs a smaller body size. This is what we should be aiming for is not a goal of mine
Mhm,
at all.
mhm,
When it comes to the intuitive eating, there's so much about the intuitive eating that I really like about, really evaluating one's relationship with food and what's triggering the desire for the food right now. Is it a feeling of, actually having hunger and not feeling satiated and being in touch with the drivers of emotion and pressure and kind of letting go of some of those like really black and white ideals and some of the perfectionistic tendencies that our society puts around us, around our body. I think my biggest concern around where intuitive eating and the addiction model need to talk to each other a little bit is that there's evidence that it's much harder to intuitively eat these engineered foods that are addictive. And so let me give you a couple pieces of evidence for me that makes me think that this is tricky and that it would be helpful if we could acknowledge that the food itself can make it challenging to eat intuitively and that informing people of this may help them be able to guide themselves more about making choices that are mindful and purposeful and fit with their goals. So in my lab, I have this simulated fast food restaurant lab. And it smells like French fries, and it looks like a fast food restaurant, and it has all those cues. And we randomly assign people to come into our fast food restaurant or kind of a neutral setting that isn't super cute and triggering. And as soon as people walk into our restaurant, even though they've just been randomly assigned to it, they'll all of a sudden say, I am really hungry. I need to eat. I'm hungry. My stomach is rumbling, right? And if I assigned that same person into a room that wasn't cute and triggering, they would say, I'm not that hungry. And so we know when you're in those really rich, cued environments, it can start to trigger, actually biologically, those gut hormones that
mhm,
tell you, I'm hungry. And so it can be really hard I think, to dissociate between a hedonic hunger that is masquerading as a physical hunger from an actual I am calorically deprived and I need to fuel myself in a way that's meaningful. So I think that's really hard for people to distinguish because they are biologically intertwined. They aren't two separate systems. Then there's another study that came out recently that just knocked my socks off. Kevin Hall, who's at the National Institute of Health, brought people in. These aren't food addicts. These are just kind of your average, people in America. And he had them live at the National Institute of Health for a month. And for 2 weeks, they had access to all minimally processed foods, all their foods. It was convenient. It was inexpensive, right? They could eat whenever they felt like it, stopped whenever they felt like it, really, listened to their signals. And then for 2 weeks, he created a food environment that was all ultra processed food. Same amount of calories were available, same macronutrients. Peep was convenient. It was, free. People could just tell them when they wanted to eat and just listen to their signals about when they felt they wanted to eat and when they wanted to stop. Same exact people, when they were in the ultra processed food environment, they ate 500 more calories a day than they did in the minimally processed. They didn't report that they felt more hungry when they were eating the 500 calories more a day. It was just kind of the food itself was like kind of driving forward this kind of rapid eating and this, greater caloric intake. They were gaining weight more rapidly in that ultra processed food environment in a way that they weren't aware of. And then when they looked at what was going on in their gut signaling for the signals that tell you whether you're hungry or whether you're full, being exposed to the ultra processed food environment for just 2 weeks started to mess up those signals in a way that wouldn't accurately signal to your body whether you were actually full or whether you were actually hungry. Those signals of telling you that you could rely on to intuitively, try and understand, am I hungry or am I full? We're getting messed up.
yeah,
And so I think that learning your signals about hunger and satiety and when it's kind of boredom or emotion or drive and all those things are really key. But I also don't want to underplay to people how challenging it is if your diet is dominated and we know our environment is dominated in these evolutionarily novel industry products that start to override and mess up our ability to really tap into our hunger and satiety signals. And so I think that the diet quality can really aid us in being able to rely more successfully on those intuitive signals to help us eat in a way that promotes sanity and not, leads us to feel out of control of our eating. So again, it's kind of going back to that complexity. I feel like there's something that the food itself brings to the table that can either support or make it more challenging to rely on intuitive eating principles.
Yeah.
So that's my thought process on it and how they can work together. But I'm very open to kind of hearing, kind of feedback about what I might be missing.
Yeah, no, I love that you brought that up, and I love that study you're talking about. I printed the whole
Yeah,
thing
I'm obsessed
out.
with it.
It has detailed pictures of the
Yeah,
foods and everything, and I think it's a brilliant study. I love
totally.
how it was ad libitum too. Like they weren't
Yeah,
restricting anybody's portions, and they really tried to equalize the macronutrients. Like they were actually
yeah.
having to add fiber to the processed
Yes, totally. It
foods,
was
which
such a
is
well
so
done study.
sad.
I
But even
know.
despite having to add the fiber, the people that were eating the processed foods were just eating more without feeling like they were eating more,
Yeah,
which in some
exactly.
ways is like you're missing out, because
Yes,
if you're
totally.
eating the minimally processed and whole foods, you get to eat less calories and feel more full and
Yes,
satisfied, which is an advantage.
yes.
And then when you're talking about your lab, I immediately thought of the example I put in my book, which I think everybody can relate to this:
Yeah.
movie theaters.
Oh gosh,
As
yes.
soon as you walk in, I mean, like, you just want some popcorn. Like,
And your mouth starts
yeah.
watering. I mean, your
And
body is physiologically like, yeah, let's
yes,
go
give me
for
some of that. I
this.
mean, it smells
Yeah.
so good, it tastes so good, and I've had to learn over time because it does not make me feel good at all. Like I do
No.
not have a good
Yeah.
reaction to it, and so I have to like talk myself through it. Like I know you want it, but you're gonna feel horrible afterwards. Of course,
Yeah.
I sneak in my own, stuff
Yeah,
that
yeah,
I can
yeah.
munch on to
Totally.
help. But that's an example of that cephalic phase response. Like your body's
Yes,
like, oh
totally.
no, we're ready to eat now, girl. I don't care if you just had a 5 course gourmet meal, you're eating this popcorn.
Totally. And addictive substances do that same thing in a way that's really interesting is that the cues in the environment where you've used alcohol or cocaine, like your body's trying to keep equilibrium. It finds huge hits of sugar or fats or all those sorts of things overwhelming. And so if just like you walk in the movie theater and your body's already preparing for it and your blood sugar's changing and all sorts of things are changing to say, all right, hook me up, get my fix.
Yes.
We see that same thing happens that it triggers people to use is that if you walk into a setting where you've used cocaine a lot, your body before you've used the cocaine starts
It's
doing the
ready.
opposite action of the cocaine to try and protect you. And so if you don't take the cocaine, you feel kind of crappy, you
Yeah.
know? And so we're seeing these similar kind of processes happening where the cues and the context in the environment are really key factors that can make it challenging for us to kind of maintain what is maintain our goals for what's best for
Yeah.
our mental and physical health.
Wow, so complex. The human body is just
Yeah,
amazing in so many ways. So many ways we don't even know yet, Thank
totally.
goodness
There's
for
so much to
researchers like you
discover.
out there taking time to discover these processes. But let's touch on a second on
Mhm.
restriction, because I feel
Yes,
too this is part of the American culture, is diet
yes.
culture. Let's be skinnier. Part of my journey is I started dieting at age 9. Not a
Yeah,
good
yeah.
thing to do. I do not advocate putting kids on restrictive diets, but I feel like that set me up for some of
Hmm.
these inappropriate relationships I had with food. So
Yeah,
what evidence do we have out there about food restriction, and not even just voluntary food restriction that
yeah,
so many of us do? Like we voluntarily restrict our food, but food
yeah.
insecurity. Like we know that there's
Yes,
still so many people that experience food insecurity, and we see that they end up with some of the same tendencies. Can you tell me a little bit more
absolutely.
about that?
Yeah, so I think this is another area where there's some adversarialness of like the idea that addictive eating would mean like I want to promote like restriction and I feel like this for me is why it's really important to focus on kind of the quality of the food that people are ingesting because what we see across every addiction, if you want to increase the addictiveness of any drug out there, food deprivation sets reward systems of the brain up to be to have an amplified response to addictive substances. So if you smoke a cigarette when you're food deprived, it's going to be more reinforcing. If you drink, more reinforcing. Cocaine, more reinforcing when you are food deprived. Because these reward systems that addictive substances hijack are the ones that were set up to make sure we were getting enough calories and
Mm,
enough food. And so they are very, very sensitive to periods of caloric deprivation and restriction, and the reward system gets more sensitive and more ready to like set you up to seek it out to go get it. And so I really talk to a lot of people about, one of the worst things you can do is this kind of intermittent periods of restriction and caloric deprivation is the perfect setting and condition to enhance the addictiveness of these foods that are already engineered to be really reinforcing. And when we look at the work that we've been doing, is that we see that there's kind of two pathways to this kind of addictive profile of eating. The more dominant one is actually that people will start kind of overeating and binging first, that they'll have that early reward drive for these foods and kind of, will sneak them or eat to the point where they feel really sick. And then as they get older and body image and kind of, parental pressure, things like that start to say, oh my gosh, you're gaining weight. This isn't good. Then there'll be these crash diets and these periods of caloric restriction, which adds fuel to the fire of an existing heightened drive and desire. That they may themselves have an individually strong reward drive for genetic reasons. But then the food themselves is hijacked to be, is engineered to be so rewarding. And then when you add this intermittent food deprivation and restriction, it just sets the perfect conditions for those things to really be problematic. We do see that's about two-thirds of folks. It does seem that there's about a third of folks where the deprivation and the dieting started first, and there wasn't as much of like a strong drive or appeal for these foods. But after you do start depriving yourself and restricting, it can really kind of again sensitize these reward systems in a way that sets you up to start to develop a sensitivity to the addictive pull of these foods. Um, and so, one of the things I really feel a lot of empathy because, and this is why I like still try and get into this space, is that as scientists, like, you know, it, our dieting culture is so gross. It's not focused on health. It's not focused about worry about your mental, your physical well-being or your mental well-being. It's about, achieving a certain beauty ideal
yes.
very often in our pop culture. And these beauty ideals are socially constructed. They have racial overtones, they have classist overtones, right? It's not about health. It's about, reaching this beauty ideal. That's what the diet industry is often capitalizing on very much. And so, doing restrictive and unhealthy practices to achieve that beauty ideal, it is not, that doesn't, it isn't counterintuitive to what they want to achieve because they don't really care about the health per se. It's about the beauty ideal, the Instagram model, things like that. And so I think a lot, though, of I have parents reaching out to me who are saying, I don't know what to do. I have, a 9-year-old child. They're pre-diabetic and they have such a strong drive for these foods and they will, if they're there, they'll eat them to the point where they throw up and they'll sneak them and they just find them so enticing and rewarding. That dopamine signaling, that you're talking about is just so strong. But gosh, I want to help them, where they're not over consuming. It isn't healthy for them. They feel awful. They're sluggish afterwards. But if I restrict in any way, or, if I put any bounds around this, people tell me I'm giving them an eating disorder. What do I do? I
Mhm.
can't just let it go and not try and help this, behavior just continue. But on the other end, the only people who are kind of talking in my ears when I'm Googling are the dieting industry. And so, as a scientist, I feel like we have a responsibility to try and help people have strategies that don't set them up to get sucked into this icky, unhealthy diet culture, but can help us maybe put some guardrails up to help people, and especially children who are showing these early signs of struggling, to have a healthier relationship with food without backfiring and causing restrictive, unhealthy, you know, uh, poor image, poor low self-esteem sort of relationship with food. And unfortunately, we really don't have the answer as a scientific community. But I'm worried a little bit that like there's a pressure to not be in that space as scientists right now. I think because of all the toxicity of the diet community. But I got to tell you, it's not like if we're not there, the diet community is not going to fill that space, through a capitalistic desire to make money. And so, as a scientist, I'm trying to figure out how do I fill that space and try and provide some guidance based on helping people and supporting people without encouraging restrictive, extreme behaviors, but not seeming like I'm trying to promote a diet culture that's all about thin ideals that are just total crappy social constructions that aren't aiding
Yes.
anyone. So it's
What a
it's
tough
again, it's
spot.
complex, and I'm trying to enter that space without encouraging harm.
Absolutely. And you answered one of the biggest questions in my mind, which is the chicken and egg of
Yeah,
restriction and this overeating addictive relationship with food, which comes first. And so you're
yeah,
saying that for a lot of people, it's the starting to consume more and more of these foods, and then maybe they end up with, okay, I need to restrict because I need to look a certain way, or I've been told. And maybe that was for me. I think something that's super
yeah,
interesting is genetics
yeah,
and
yeah,
the
yeah,
different propensity that people have, because I was also born a preemie, low birth weight, and my
yeah.
mom had
Oh, that's
preeclampsia.
very high
So
risk,
I
totally.
was stressed in the womb and coming out kicking and fighting, get me all the calories, So I got chubby
Yeah,
really fast. And I've
yeah,
always loved food too. So my phenotype is I don't discriminate. I love all
yeah, yeah,
foods,
yeah,
you
yeah,
know?
yeah, yeah.
And then it was the
100%.
same thing you were saying. When I was 8 or 9, my family's like, oh no, this is
Yeah,
getting out of hand. You need to stop eating. And then that
yeah,
began the roller coaster. Plus my perfectionistic personality type of all or nothing, black and white thinking. So there's
yeah,
so many little complex pieces, just like you were saying. It's
totally.
so fascinating. But I agree that for the children, for their, and I always go back, well-being, joy, and
Yeah,
longevity, that's what I want for them. I'm not
yeah,
wanting
yeah,
them to
yeah,
be a certain body size or look great in a bikini or whatever. I
yeah.
want them to live long, happy, healthy lives where they feel like they have the potential to do anything that they desire in life. So I'm happy to work with you on that too. If you ever need feedback from a
Yeah,
pediatrician, reach out, because that's definitely
that would
one
be
of my
wonderful.
passions. Oh, this has
That would
been
be
so
wonderful.
great. Thank you. So let's wrap
Oh,
up. I
my
know you're
pleasure.
so
Yeah,
busy. So just a few more questions.
sure.
What do you wish more people knew about food addiction?
Yeah, I think that I wish more people knew that it doesn't mean all or nothing eating, right? It doesn't mean if there is an addictive pull to these foods, it doesn't mean that, oh, you should never, ever, ever have any sort of processed junk food in your life ever again. In the same way that we know alcohol is addictive and, it can be a part of many people's lifestyle. But it does become something you do want to kind of keep an eye on and monitor and make sure it isn't taking on a life of its own. And also think in the same way, I think we think about the messages that we provide to our children around addictive substances like alcohol, that with our food, it is. We really kind of want to be thoughtful around that. And so I think that's something I really wish people knew. And again, I think that idea, that misunderstanding that addiction means everybody who tries it becomes addicted, and that's really not the case. It's really a relatively small subsample of individuals who develop a full-blown addiction. But when you're in an environment that is so heavily pushing addictive substances, even if you aren't fully addicted, it can have enough of a pull over you that it can start to negatively impact your mental well-being and your physical well-being. And that, as a society, for us to advocate for a food environment that promotes health, not the, bottom line of the food industry by pushing, unhealthy foods, is something that we would all benefit from.
Oh, beautiful. I haven't asked you anything about you. So here's your opportunity
Yeah.
to tell us, what personal habit are you most proud of and why?
Oh, I love it. So you talked about meditation and mindfulness, and for me, that is something that a few years ago I got into, and I did it. I have a daily practice, a daily sit, and I think that it's one of those tools that for me it just feels like I'm doing a weather report, like a check-in with myself. Like so much is happening unconsciously and under the surface, and many things that can drive our desire for addictive substances, like our emotions and our stress and our boredom. And so, even if I sit for 5 minutes a day, it's been kind of like a game-changing feeling of like peace. And for me, I think that's the habit that I'm like most proud of, kind of making something I do every single day.
Well, it must be working because you do seem like a very calm and centered person. So that's great.
That's kind of you. My lab will tell you that one of the things I'm most notorious for is going on rants, though. I'll be like, I'll see some advertisement that, like, for, pushing some food to kids and like trying to trick parents. And I'll spend like the first 20 minutes of our lab meeting, like up on my soapbox. And so I'm like, oh, Dr. Gerhardt's on a rant again. And then I need my mindfulness to bring down my, blood pressure. So
Everybody's
thank
looking at
you.
their watches. Here she goes again.
Yes, totally. I think they're like eating their popcorn while I'm like, and then this, and I'm like, "Rah!" So I maybe I fluctuate. That's why the mindfulness is so important.
Oh, that's so awesome. Well, Dr. Gearhart, this has been fantastic. I know that my listeners are going to want to look you up and see all the research
Yeah.
you've done. So, how can listeners connect with you and support you in your work?
That's a great question. I am, you can go to my website. You know what? I'm going to email you the new link. We just transitioned websites, and the one is out of date in my bio. So I'll send you our new website. You can go to the website. You can see our talks. You can see our papers. You can see the Yale Food Addiction Scale and its scoring information and other research that we have. If you're interested in, donating at all to support this kind of research, feel people can contact me and we can work with through the psychology department, there's opportunities to donate to support this sort of research, which is very helpful because we're up against a very well-resourced food industry,
Yes.
and supporting this kind of science can be really beneficial in trying to play catch up and really understand and what's going on in our food environment that's kind of making it hard for us to have a healthy relationship with our food. So I'll send you the new link, but if you Google me, you'll see Ashley Gerhardt in the Food and Addiction Science and Treatment Lab. That'll pop up, and people can also feel free to email me.
Great. And I'll link everything in the show notes and we'll make sure
That
people
sounds
can reach
great.
you. That is so, so great. So exciting. Well, thank you so much for your time. And
My
I'm
pleasure.
so grateful, like I said before, that there are researchers and brilliant people like yourself and other researchers out there that care about this. And I'm so glad we talked because I agree with you that sometimes it feels adversarial. It feels like
Mhm.
in our minds, when we don't get to meet people and see their true nature in their hearts and what they really care about, we care about the same things. You know,
Yes,
we have the same
exactly.
goals in mind. We just want to help people. We want to help people get to that well being they desire. It's not about being right or wrong, it's about
Yeah,
working together towards this goal. And I hope that I can bring more communities together like that so that we can more effectively make those strides. Because when we work together, it's synergistic. So thank you so
absolutely.
much for that. And if you could just
My
leave
pleasure.
us with one call to action for the week, what one thing can we do this week to improve our lives?
Oh, that's such a good question. So I would say, the one thing I think I'll ask people to do that might be a little different than as usual is, again, I focus so much on the structural forces that, make it challenging for us to live our best lives. And so I would say if you get a moment, look up who your senator is in Congress, your House representative is, and, send them an email, give them a call to tell them how important you think it is to set policies that promote health in our food environment, through what we subsidize, for what we allow to be marketed, and that is absolutely essential to not only our current well-being but the future generations' well-being. So advocate and take action for there to be for the people in power, the change agents, to set us up to succeed rather than to have to try so hard and a challenging environment to, meet our health goals.
Oh, that is such a great call to action. And you're right. You're the only one that's ever said that. But you're also right in that we have to make changes to our environment. If we don't make changes to our environment, it's just that much harder. Why I love the Blue Zones projects and people that are
Yeah,
trying to change the culture, the structures around us. And the way we can start is by talking to the people in charge. So thank you so much,
absolutely.
Dr.
My
Gearhart. Thank you for
pleasure.
being here. And I hope
My
that you
pleasure. It was a
have a
joy.
very plantastic day.
Thank you so much.
Hey, veggie lover, I hope that you loved today's episode. Will you take a second and do me a huge favor? Please subscribe to my podcast so that you never miss an episode. You're the reason I'm here, and I want to share it all with you. Thank you for listening and have a plantastic day.